Hi, I'm Shannon Spires, and we're going to talk about simulation environments, specifically one simulation environment called NetLogo, and we're going to go into detail on how to use it, and we're going to discuss how to use it to model the Neo-Luddite problem. So first, I want to talk about the history of Logo. Logo is a computer language. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not have. It's not terribly popular anymore, but it is very suitable for our purposes today. The history of Logo is that it was designed in about 1967 by several people, including Seymour Papert. And it was originally designed as a language for teaching children how to program computers. At that time, it was kind of an innovative and groundbreaking language, but it didn't really catch on with the computer science community until it evolved into StarLogo and now NetLogo for multi-agent simulations. Throughout the 90s, it sort of gained in popularity because it's capable of representing the actions of individual agents in an environment very nicely. So I want to show you how to download it and use it on your computer now. First thing to do is go to this URL at Northwestern University. Probably the easiest way to do it is to do a Google search on NetLogo. And probably the first link that pops up will be the home page of NetLogo. Let me see if I can bring it up here. That's not quite it, but it's close. There's some documentation there too, but the first thing I want you to do is go to the home page and download it. It's an application written in Java, and so it works on pretty much any computer, Mac, Linux, PC. So download the specific version of NetLogo that you need for your computer. And I think on the Windows distribution, it even comes with a Java runtime environment, so you don't have to separately download Java if you don't already have it on your computer. And then follow whatever instructions are appropriate for your platform to install it. On the Macintosh, it's a DMG file. On Windows, there's an installer wizard for it. So install it and then start it running. You'll find some documentation there too. There's very good documentation on NetLogo, and we're going to go through the screens of that documentation to some extent, which you'll see next. You can also do some research on NetLogo on Wikipedia. It's got a nice entry, and there's also some information on Logo in there too. So let's go through the initial running and hello world process with NetLogo. I'll start NetLogo. And this will start with a blank world. There's nothing really here. Now I'm running this on a Macintosh, but if you're using a Windows or a Linux machine, you'll see that the interface is very similar. Not quite exactly the same though. But what is the same are all of these controls here. The tabs up the top are very important. We have interface, information, and procedures. We always start out with interface. This is the Logo world right here, where the agents will be interacting. So let's do what's essentially a hello world application. First thing we'll do is we'll create a button. Select a button here. It's already selected. We'll click Add. And then we'll create a button called Setup. You'll find that there's buttons called Setup in almost every Logo application, in every NetLogo application. And we'll tell it to create turtles 1. That means create one turtle. Now the agents in Logo have traditionally been called turtles. That's just a generic term now, but again, it was created as a pedagogical language for teaching children. And they thought turtles sounded kind of cute. So to this day, the canonical root class of all agents is the turtle. We're going to be creating some other classes later on, but for right now, the default class is turtle. So we're going to create one of those. So if I click this button, it'll create one turtle. You can see this guy right here. It's a little triangle. It's one turtle. Well, that's not terribly interesting. So let's add another button to make him do something. And typically we call these buttons Go. Setup and Go are the two buttons you find very commonly in Logo. And we'll tell this agent to turn right by 10 degrees. And then go forward 2 units. Okay. Oh, looks like I've got a syntax error because this is red. We can edit by right-clicking on the button. On a Mac, you can control-click on the button. You can't use right in an observer context because right is turtle only. We'll go into this in a minute, but for right now we have to make this be a command to a turtle rather than a command to the observer, which the observer is the overall overarching entity that controls the simulation. But this is a command just for individual turtles, so we select turtles in the menu up here and that'll fix that problem. I'm also going to click the forever button because that makes this button be essentially an infinite loop. We can do loops in the program too, but it's easier just to click the forever button. Okay, now we notice that the syntax error is gone. We see a turtle here indicating that the button controls a turtle, and we see this double arrow loop here that indicates that this is a forever button or an infinite loop. So again, now we've done everything. Now we need to make this thing move. We'll click go. And it's moving too fast to really even see what's going on. So let me slow it down. This is your speed control up here. To the left means slower. And we can kind of see this thing running around a little bit. And we'll notice he's kind of moving in a circle, but it's halfway on the screen and halfway off the screen. Let's see if we can visualize that a little better. We can give the turtles individual commands down here. We can say pin down. And again, we have to tell this to be the context of turtles. And so now, everywhere the turtle goes, he leaves a trail behind. That's what pin down does. And why is he turning in a circle? Well, let's go back and look at the code. By clicking the go button a second time, it stops. So when the button turns black, it's running. Just simply click it again and it stops. So we'll do a control click on this or a right click and edit this button. Now let's look at this code again. We said turn right 10 degrees and go forward 2 units. So if you were to do that, you can imagine standing in a room and turn to the right 10 degrees and go forward 2 steps. And then do it again. Turn to the right 10 degrees and then go forward 2 steps. And continue to do that, you're going to end up walking in a circle. So that's why this turtle traces out a circle. This is not ridiculously interesting, but this is kind of hello world. Let's make things a little bit more complicated. We'll edit the setup button. We'll make a few more turtles. Let's make 100 instead of just 1. And we'll also put a command to clear all up here. This means get rid of any existing turtles that happen to be there. And then finally we'll say forward 4. So what this will do is it will create 100 turtles right in the middle of the screen and then tell them to march forward 4 steps. Nope, got a syntax error. Why? Because we're telling turtles to move forward, but we haven't made that specific. So the way we do that is to say ask turtles to forward 4. And we bracket the procedure with plain old square brackets. And this is the same thing that we did before when we said, which context are we talking to? This is the programmatic way to do that same thing. We want all the turtles in the simulation to go forward 4 steps. So we'll do a setup. And that's exactly what we told them to do. They start out at random orientations from the center, and they simply march forward 4 steps. Now what do you think is going to happen if we click the go button? Well, we've essentially told all of those turtles now to go in a circle. Let's speed this up a little bit. It's not at all clear that they're going in a circle, but they really are. And if I do the pin down trick again, you should be able to see that. So what we have here is 100 turtles who start out organized in a circle, and each one of them then draws a circle. and we can control the speed up at the top. So that's basically Hello World in Logo. Now, one thing to notice also is that we didn't actually change the Go command when we added all 100 turtles. It's still the same as it was before. And that's because any command you give to the group turtles as a whole applies to all of them that exist in the environment. So it's very quick to assign the same set of instructions to a large group of actors. Now I'm going to go into the documentation a little bit for NetLogo. Once you've downloaded it and once you've started it up, you can open this documentation on your own machine, or you can browse it on the web. Doesn't matter. It depends on if you have a net connection or not. I would encourage you to go through this documentation, and especially to go through these 3 tutorials over here on the left side, because they're very good to get up, a very good way to get up to the speed on the Logo language and on the NetLogo environment. The first model that you'll go through with a tutorial is called wolf-sheep predation. And I'm going to go through some of that for you so that you can see how it works. But I'm not going to go through the whole thing because you're going to have more time to do this on your own, and you'll learn more about it if you do it on your own. So please do go through these tutorials. But just briefly, I'll show you what these models look like. Now, up in the File menu, and this is true on all platforms, there's this entry called the Models Library. This is very handy. These are a large number of pre-canned models that come with NetLogo in various categories of simulation. And there's even some system dynamics models down here, which you will probably want to play with when Dr. Engie covers system dynamics later in the course. But for right now, let's click on the biology link, open that up, and go down to the bottom and open this wolf-sheep predation. And NetLogo opens that up. And now we have a fairly complicated control panel over here. But I'm going to show you what that means. Again, we have these, notice we have these setup and go buttons. Almost every simulation has a setup and go button. And if you create a new one from scratch, it's probably a good idea to follow that convention, although it's not essential. Now in this case, when we click setup, Logo creates 2 types of agents, wolves and sheep. And we can kind of see, let me see if I can get this. No, I can't really zoom this up, but you can see that it uses 2 different icons to represent sheep and wolves. So it helps you visualize what's going on. And furthermore, we've got a setting here, a slider that says the initial number of sheep and the initial number of wolves. And if I set this up to a higher number, let's make this 250 and do setup again, well, there's a lot more sheep. And we do this with a lot more wolves, and we have a lot more wolves. So pretty straightforward. And I'll show you how to make these controls later. It's very handy to have these controls so that you can control the setup and the operation of your simulation. So let's just run this and see what happens. I hit go, and we can see on the right side of the screen here that the place is filling up with sheep pretty quick. And in fact, NetLogo has given us a graph down here on the left with the populations of sheep and wolves. Sheep are in blue, wolves are in red. And look what happened here. We started out with sheep outnumbering the wolves. That peaked, and then the sheep took a nosedive, and then the wolves started picking up, and then both populations went to 0. Let's run it again. The way you run it again is to go back to setup and hit go. Watch the graph. So what's underlying this simulation? What's going on here? Well, let's look at the code. Actually, let's look at the information panel first. I want you to concentrate now on these top 3 tabs. We've had the interface tab, which is the farthest left one, open all the time so far. But I want to show you what the other 2 do, because you'll want to become familiar with these. Let's start with information. Information is where you can put information for the user of your model. So there's a description. What is this? This model explores the stability of predator-prey ecosystems. How does it work? Well, In this case, the wolves and sheep wander randomly around the landscape. The wolves look for sheep to prey on. And every time the wolves move, or the sheep move, for that matter, they use up a certain amount of energy. And when they use up too much energy, they die. Now the wolves replenish their energy by eating the sheep, and the sheep replenish their energy by eating grass. And in addition, the wolves and sheep have a fixed probability of reproducing at each time step. So this is based on some fairly well-known models in the agent modeling community. Walensky and Riesman, and later on in system dynamics you'll see the Volterra model, which is a system dynamics model of this same world. So further down in the information you'll see how to use it, some instructions for what the sliders do and how to use them, and things to notice and things to try. I would encourage you to go through these. Let's go through a couple more of them. Do setup again. And in our previous run, grass was turned off. So let's turn grass on. What does it mean to turn grass on? Well, it means that the grass is available to be eaten by the sheep. And the grass is now a finite resource. The grass can regrow over time, but if the sheep eat it all, it can't regrow, and the sheep eventually die of starvation. So let's run this and see what happens. Now we see that the grass changes color to brown to indicate it's been eaten. But it will eventually replenish itself. Now we're getting much more interesting population dynamics now that we have wolves, sheep, and grass in the simulation. So grass is actually an agent unto itself. It's a third category of agent unto itself here. The only difference is grass doesn't move while the sheep and the wolves do. So now we see this very interesting population graph going on. The wolves eat the sheep, they gain energy, it takes energy to reproduce, so the wolves reproduce. But if they eat all the sheep, they will die of starvation. As the sheep get fewer in number, wolves reproduce less, which allows the sheep to reproduce more. So we see some, pseudo quasi-stability happening here. So I would encourage you to run this and play with these numbers, play with the sliders, like the sheep reproduction rate. And you can run these sliders while the model is running. You can move the sliders while the model is running, and watch how the curves change. So just moving that slider, the sheep reproduction rate, was very interesting. Notice that it caused the wolves to increase in number, but it only momentarily caused the sheep to increase in number. But it caused a long-term change in the wolf population. Interesting, no? Okay. Now let's look at the third tab up at the top. We'll stop this and go to the Procedures tab. This is probably the most important tab because this is where the code is located. Now you saw before how we put code in these buttons, but generally speaking you don't want to put a lot of code in the buttons. You want to make the buttons run a subroutine that's in the Procedures panel. So in this case the Setup button just runs a command called Setup. We don't have a lot of code in here. So let's go to the Procedures panel. We can see what the Setup command does. Here it is. And it says to setup, clear all. Now this word to is a very common one in Logo. It's the introduction of a subroutine. Whenever you want to create a new subroutine, you start it with the word to, T0. T-O, not the number 0, the letter 0. And so we'll clear all. We saw that we used the clear all subroutine before. And ask all the patches. Patches are the squares in the environment. And in this case we're using patches to represent grass. So we're asking all the patches to set their color to green. And here we have if grass is turned on, we ask the patches to initialize themselves. So there's a lot of code in here. I'm not going to go through it. What I'd like for you to do is go through the tutorials and learn to read this language yourself because it's fairly straightforward. It's a pretty simple language. If you've ever programmed in any other language, you'll pick this one up pretty quickly. Now let's go back to the interface panel and look at the Go button. We just looked at the Setup button. In the Go button, we just have, again, a single command called Go. Well, let's go look and see what Go does in the Procedures panel. Here's to Go. This is the Go routine. And it says, if there's not any turtles, stop. Remember how I said before that all agents were called turtles? If you want to use the generic word for all agents in the system, the word is turtles. So if there's no agents left in the system, then stop the simulation. Now, if that's not true, we'll continue on down here, if there's any still left. And here we say, ask just the sheep agents to move. And we'll look at move in a second. And if there's grass, if grass is turned on, then decrease their energy by 1 point, which represents the energy they lost by moving around. And then eat some grass, and then reproduce, and then potentially die. And that's all this is. And furthermore, then we ask the wolves to do something. Well, we ask them to move, decrease their energy because of motion, and then the wolves catch sheep, and they reproduce and die. And finally down here, we do a tick, and a tick is just a synchronization primitive. You can use it or not use it, but it makes some things a little easier because it creates a tick, a time epoch for the simulation, where everything happens at once. And remember Dr. Goldsmith talked about how to control which things happen at which times. Well, you can run this asynchronously, but the tick causes the model to run synchronously. So it causes there to be particular periods of time at which you can mark all the changes to all the agents as having happened. And it's particularly useful for drawing the display and drawing the plots. So you usually put a tick in your go routine someplace, usually right before your plot. So now let's go to this move thing. Remember up above we said the sheep and the wolf are moving? Well, here's the routine for move. To move, we go right by a random amount of degrees up to 50, between 0 and 49 in fact. And then we turn left by a random amount between 0 and 49, and then go forward by 1 unit. So effectively what this is a random walk. We want these things to move around mostly so that they will encounter each other in the environment in some way. And then eating grass. Only sheep eat grass, but if a sheep eats grass, first of all, we set the color of the patch that grass was on to brown, and then we increase the sheep's energy by sheep gain from food. Well, what's sheep gain from food? Well, it's actually a slider. It's this slider right here. So you can have direct relationships between variables called out in the procedures and sliders and controls on the main page, and that's how you create these linkages. But again, go through the tutorials and they'll explain in much more detail how to do that. So let's see if there's anything else that's interesting in here. Yeah, so when a wolf catches a sheep, here's to catch sheep. Let the prey be one of the sheep here. That means find the set of sheep that is on the same patch of ground that I am, if I am a wolf. And if there's one there, if there's even one there, pick one of them. If there's one, pick that one. If there's more than one, choose one at random. That's what one of does. And if prey is not equal to nobody, essentially means if we got one at all, then ask that prey to die, which makes it disappear from the simulation, and set the wolf's energy to wolf gain from food. And wolf gain from food is also a slider on the main page. So there's not a whole lot in this. As you can see, it's just, you could probably print this out on a couple of pages of paper. And then update plot is the routine which causes the plot to be drawn at the lower left corner of the screen. So let's run this one more time. There's not a lot of code here, and there typically isn't in NetLogo simulations. And yet we can get fairly complicated behavior from simple agents, simple actors, executing simple code, but when they interact in a large scale, complicated things happen. So much for that. Now let's move on to the Neo-Luddite model. Now this model is on your course website. It's called Neo-Luddites 3. But it should be up on the course website along with these videos and the PowerPoint presentation. So once you've downloaded NetLogo, you should be able to download the Neo-Luddites 3 model from the website and open it in NetLogo. And one way to do that is double click on it as I just did. Another way to do it is to simply go to the File menu and do Open as you would any other file and choose it that way. So I'm not going to do that, but I assume you know how to do that. So we're not seeing the whole model because of the limitations of this screen, but I think you'll probably see it in higher resolution on your screen when you run it. So let's click Setup. Now over here, what do we see? We see some gray things and some blue things and some red things. These all are little icons representing people. And there's 3 different kinds of people or agents in this simulation. The gray agents are bystanders. They're just people who are in the native population. The red agents represent Neo-Luddites, people who have grown dissatisfied with technology and have decided to become terrorists or insurgents. The blue people are what we call friendlies here, or counterinsurgents or counter-Neo-Luddites. In this case, we just call them friendlies. And they've been sent in to counter the Neo-Luddite threat. Now, the Neo-Luddites hate the friendlies. The red guys hate the blue guys, and vice versa, pretty much. So when we start these things moving around, the Neo-Luddite, the red guys, will try to zero in on the nearest blue person and follow him. Once the Neo-Luddite gets within very close range of one of the blue agents, he will set off a bomb and explode himself and the blue agent and any bystanders that happen to be in the vicinity. Now when that happens, naturally, lots of these agents die. And furthermore, another way that the agents can die is when the blue agent gets close to a red one. If the blue agent sees the red one before vice versa, the blue agent can shoot the red one with a gun. So he doesn't really cause bombs in this explosion, he just shoots. And so the blue agents can kill the red ones by shooting them, but there's also some possibility that the blue ones will accidentally kill one of the gray ones too. And if any of the gray ones die, the gray ones become angry, and more of the red guys, the Neo-Luddites, can be born from the gray population. So the way replenishment works in this model is that the insurgents, the terrorists, the Neo-Luddites, after they're killed, they're replenished from the gray population, the bystander population. The blue agents, the friendlies, are replenished from the outside world at a slow, constant rate. And the grays are always replenished to be at a level of whatever the background level is. So this is an open system. More agents can come in from the outside world. Except for the Neo-Luddites. They're only homegrown. So let's run this now so we can kind of see what's going to happen. We'll just click again the Go button, and we see them start moving around. The bystanders don't move because they really don't need to. Now the big red splotches are explosions, and they're the result of a red agent getting close to a blue one and blowing himself up. And he also kills everything that's in that explosion range, the blast radius. Look at the graph that's going down in the lower left corner. The blue curve at the top is the number of friendlies. The red one is the number of Neo-Luddites. And the bottom spiky curve is the number of bystander deaths, instantaneous bystander deaths. This one's not cumulative. Now, as we said before, when bystanders die, it causes anger in the remaining bystander population, and it causes more Neo-Luddites to be born. So that's why the red curve doesn't just go down monotonically. Furthermore, we see the blue curve kind of going up and down a little bit because the Neo-Luddites are killing the blue agents. And we also have graphs here, if you scroll down, of attrition, so we can see how many neo-Luddites are dying, how many friendlies are dying, and we've already seen up here that we've got the number of bystanders that are dying. The thing we really want to look at here is who's winning. Are the blues winning or are the reds winning? Well, right now the blues are. And it looks like it may be stable, although the numbers seem to be sort of converging a little bit. Now up here on the left we can see this box that says friendlies. This is another one of the devices that you can put in your logo simulation. It's called a monitor. And you can see an instantaneously updated number of a current population or any other number in the system for that matter. Let's get rid of that. So this is the instantaneous number of friendlies, and the interesting thing to look here is that this number is very close to the number that we have decided should be the level of friendlies. We're not having any trouble maintaining that number. But what happens if we start changing things? Like, what happens if we ramp up this blast radius so that more people die whenever one of the neo-Luddite bombs goes off? Well, let's watch the curves, see if they change. Well, we see a lot more of the bystanders dying now. And we see more friendlies dying. And the red curve's actually going up too, although it's harder to see because it's covered up by the bystander deaths. Let's scroll down and look at the relative populations as a percentage, and we can see that, aha, they've crossed over. Now, the neo-Luddites are winning the war because there's more of them than there are of the friendlies. So the question becomes, will this stay at this state, or will things settle down again at a different state? And it looks like they're crossing over again. Or not. So the obvious thing that I wanted you to see here is that the behavior of the system can change very drastically by changing one of these variables, in this case the blast radius. Let's put this back down to 2.0 where it was. And let's stop the simulation and restart it. Now there's another parameter in here that's interesting, which I've called general anger and death anger. Remember I said that when the bystanders get killed, the remaining bystanders become angry and they create more terrorists. That's represented by the death anger. This is how likely is it, on a scale of 1 to 100, that the death of a bystander will create the birth of a new terrorist. Now the general anger is related, but it's slightly different, because let's say, for example, that the terrorists' numbers went down to 0. Well, if that happened, there would be no further way for any bystanders to die. Nobody else would be getting killed, because the blue forces don't intentionally shoot the bystanders, and there's no red forces to explode bombs. So if that happened, there would be no more terrorists being born. I think that's probably not realistic, because the presence of the blue forces alone is enough to make the bystanders somewhat angry. So we need some non-zero probability that terrorists or neo-Luddites will still be born, even if no bystanders are dying. And that's what general anger is for. And so this says, even if nobody dies, this is the likelihood that new terrorists will be born. And watch what happens to the curve if we ramp that up. Now all of a sudden, the number of neo-Luddites is increased, the number of friendlies decreases, but it looks like the friendlies might get control of the situation. Now while this is running, I want to show you another option in the user interface here, which is kind of cute. If you scroll to the right, look up at the upper right corner of the world view here, and you see a button called 3D. If you click this button, you get a 3D representation of the world. And you can use your mouse to just kind of drag around and zoom in on these guys. So this is probably a little, you know, this is eye candy, but it's kind of nice for visualizing, for example, the fact that Neo-Luddites really are born from the native population, because you can see certain members of the gray or native population, the bystanders, growing up, turning red, and becoming Neo-Luddites. So you can see the Neo-Luddites are not just being replenished from the outside world. Let me turn this off. The documentation will show you more of the options that are available in the 3D mode. Now let's look at some of the code for this. Stop the simulation and go again up to the top to the right-hand tab, the Procedures panel. And again, we've got a toSetup routine. Again, we clear all, and we do a set default shape, and this just controls the icon that represents the different kinds of agents. Some global variables, which are declared up here and initialized here. And then we set up patches, Neo-Luddites, bystanders, and friendlies. And patches are just the background that we use to color red whenever a bomb goes off. And initially we make some bystanders, we make some friendlies, we make some Neo-Luddites, and then we go. And you'll see a pattern here. We move the friendlies, we move the Neo-Luddites, just like in the wolf and the sheep. We move, then we interact. Maybe detonate, maybe shoot, recruit new terrorists, potentially. Rebalance the population, bring in people to replace those that have been killed, do a tick, and then run the plots. And again, moving is very much like it was in the wolf and sheep scenario. We're essentially just doing a random walk of the bystanders and a random walk of the friendlies. Actually, though, in this case, I think I have move bystanders turned off. It's just commented out. If you look at the go, right here, notice that move bystanders is commented out. You can uncomment this if you want. It takes a little bit more CPU time, and I don't really think that moving the bystanders adds a whole lot to the simulation. We also move the Neo-Luddites, and they move in a very similar way to the friendlies, except that if they are looking toward an enemy that's close in radius 3, and if they're looking toward a friendly in this case, they will still move randomly, but they will move in a preferred direction of toward that friendly. So that's the only difference here. The friendlies move completely randomly. The Neo-Luddites move randomly unless they detect a friendly nearby, in which case they will try to follow him. Now, the Neo-Luddites also maybe will detonate their bomb. And the way they decide whether to do so or not is they ask, are there any friendlies standing on the same patch of ground that I am? And if there are, and the blast radius is greater than 0, then detonate. And detonate just says, change the patches within this radius to be red, and count up the number of dead, and keep track of them so that we can plot them and make decisions based on them. These are just global variables. The maybe shoot routine is only used by the friendlies, and it says, of course, ask the friendlies, all the friendlies in all the agents of class friendly, to count the Neo-Luddites in cone. And in cone is a net logo primitive that says find everybody that's in a it's in a wedge. It's actually sort of a pie-shaped wedge more than it is a cone. Anybody that's 3 units or less from me within a 45-degree window. So the friendlies are looking for neo-Luddites that are essentially right in front of them. And if there are any, shoot them. Now shoot is the next routine, and that's very important. You need to notice this because there's going to be a homework problem that is related to this. The shoot routine is called by the friendlies to kill the neo-Luddites that are in front of them. So we're essentially asking the enemies, which are neo-Luddites in this case, to die, which makes them disappear from the simulation. And we count up the number who've died. But here, this is the interesting part, the collaterals, because we want to make sure that the friendlies aren't perfect. Remember, agent-based systems typically can't be expected to be perfect. They have limitations. The individual agents have limitations. And in this case, the limitation is that the friendlies aren't perfect shots. They will kill the neo-Luddites that are near them, but they may also kill some bystanders. And in wartime, this is typically called collateral damage. And this obviously increases the anger of the bystanders toward the friendlies and makes them more likely to create more terrorists. So in one of your homework problems, I'm going to ask you to change this so that this is not hard-coded, but rather there's a slider to control this collateral damage. And if you go through the tutorials in NetLogo, it should be fairly straightforward how to do this. Now the recruit routine, well, this one is called to encourage bystanders to become neo-Luddites. And what it essentially says is that for every bystander death, let there be a random chance that one of the existing remaining bystanders will become a neo-Luddite, or he'll defect. And in this case, all that means is set his color to red. And furthermore, we have to take into account this general anger slider that I talked about before, and that is that the way that works is that the number of friendlies in the simulation influences a background level of anger. So even if there's no neo-Luddites left, and even if no bystanders are dying, there's still some chance, if any friendlies are there at all, that neo-Luddites will be born. And population rebalance just brings in more bystanders to replace those that have died, and it brings in more friendlies to replace those that have died. And the rest of these are plot routines, which you can find out more about in the tutorial. So that's the simulation. And it may look fairly complicated at first glance, but I promise you, if you go through those tutorials and work through some of the examples and create some models of your own, this will all be fairly straightforward. Now, for anything that's in this programming language that doesn't make any sense right now, there is a dictionary in the documentation for every word in the language. Let me see if I can bring that up. There's a programming guide, and again, this is online, and it also is part of what you will download, these HTML pages, when you download NetLogo. So the language and the controls are all categorized here. So there's a lot of information about that. There's also a dictionary of every single word that's built into the language. So if we look at ask, for example, we've seen ask before. Run the given commands by the specified agent or agent set. So the documentation is very good here, and if you take advantage of it, you should be able to learn this language quick enough that you can at least make some changes to the neo-Luddite simulation. So, now for some homework. I want you to use the neo-Luddite simulation that you've got in front of you, or you should have in front of you now, and explore it a little bit. First assignment is to look at the blast radius and general anger. Those sliders that are on the front page of the simulation. Again, in the interface tab. Blast radius is here, general anger is here. Adjust those and look and see how the counts of friendlies versus neo-Luddites are affected. We did some of that already, but I'd like for you to dig into it and explain why some of these unintuitive behaviors are happening. Why is it that increasing one or both of those causes the friendlies to increase by such a large amount. And I'm not looking for an exhaustive analysis here. Just give me a few sentences about what you think is going on, and you should be able to, again, to determine what's going on simply by looking at the code that's in the procedures pane. Try and infer what's going on there, because it doesn't seem very complicated, and yet we're seeing pretty complicated kind of behavior over here. So, next question. Under what circumstances do the neo-Luddites exceed the friendlies? Well, we've already seen that a little bit, and if you ramp up the general anger and you ramp up the blast radius, then almost certainly the neo-Luddites are going to exceed the friendlies. So I've just given you that answer. What I'd like for you to do, though, is to make this happen by adjusting the sliders, either general anger, blast radius, or one of the other ones. And then I want you to click on the Surge 25% button. We haven't really talked about that yet. But this button right here it's called Surge 25%. Now what does that do? Well, let's look at it by control clicking on it or right clicking on it. There's some code in here. It says make friendlies 0.25 times max friendlies. Well, max friendlies is represented by this slider here, and right now it's set at 72. So 0.25 of that is 1/4. So this says add more friendlies in the quantity of 1/4 of whatever this slider says. So this will instantly up the number of friendlies. Let me demonstrate that. Continue the simulation. Let me run it a little bit faster so the plots will come out a little faster. In fact, I think I'll just restart it. Now we see that the reds are going up and down. Not clear who's going to win. But if we click the surge button, watch what happens to the blue curve. It instantly steps up. And we can click this button more than once. Every time we click it, another large collection of friendlies comes into the simulation. Now notice that the number over here indicates they're getting killed pretty quickly as well. So what I want you to do in this homework assignment is try and figure out under what circumstances does the surge work. Under what circumstances does the surge result in a long-term switch to a majority of friendlies? And under what circumstances does it not result in a stable long-term solution? Because you'll find that sometimes you do the surge and very quickly the friendlies will outnumber the neo-Luddites. But after only a short amount of time, the neo-Luddites will again take over and they'll be winning. So what I want you to do is look into the model and try and figure out what causes that to happen. What makes the difference? What other situations must obtain in the model for the surge to make a long-term difference? Third question. Add a slider for collateral damage. Remember I talked about the collateral damage issue in the code? What I'd like for you to do is add a slider for that so that it's no longer hard-coded into the simulation, and run some simulations with the slider at various values. Now, once again, you don't know how to do this right now, but again, if you go through the tutorial, you'll find out how to add sliders for different parameters within the simulation. So add one for that so that it comes out as a control. And finally, and question 4 is probably the most difficult and will take the most time. Right now, the current result when bystanders die is that more neo-Luddites appear. Now this is true whether the bystanders are killed by neo-Luddites or by friendlies. So the question becomes, is this really accurate? Is this really fair? Is this what happens in the real world? Obviously the bystanders are going to be upset if a friendly kills them due to collateral damage. They're also going to be upset if one of the neo-Luddites blows them up with a bomb. But the real question is, who should get blamed for that? Right now in the model, even if a neo-Luddite kills some of his brethren bystanders, the bystanders will blame the friendlies and create more neo-Luddites. Maybe that's not quite fair. So I want you to make a change to the model to make a distinction between bystander deaths caused by neo-Luddites versus those caused by collateral damage from the friendlies. such that when bystanders are killed by neo-Luddites, the neo-Luddites are penalized somehow. One way to do it is to make the friendlies more effective at killing neo-Luddites. Make their guns have a longer range, for example, or make them able to see and kill neo-Luddites in a wider angle than they are now. Another option would be to make the friendlies increase in number, make more friendlies whenever the neo-Luddite bombs kill friendlies. So it's up to you, your choice, but I want you to make a substantive change to the model such that there is a distinction between the results of killing a bystander depending on who kills him. So that's the homework, and that's the end of this lecture. And the next one we'll talk about the solutions to some of these homework problems, but I hope you have fun working on these homework problems in the meantime. Thanks.